This next session really thinks about how do we as an industry and as a value chain become more outcome focused? How do we really focus on what drives value? Remembering that the consumer is the only person who's putting new money into the supply chain. So how do we get more of that consumer dollar? By meeting or exceeding the consumer expectations, the MSA program has delivered considerable value for the industry year on year. But we can do better. We can become much more efficient in our supply chain. You heard from our panel in the previous session about the way in which we're going to embed adoption within R&D, thinking about by addressing producer priorities and shortening that pathway from R&D investment all the way through to driving practice change and impact for the industry. This session now starts to think about, well, how do we then take that further and through our production system meeting and exceeding the consumer expectation? In order to do that, we need to start with the right animal, placing better and stronger selection pressure on genetics that better, starting with the right animal, predicting an animal's performance much earlier in life, and using the feedback through the supply chain to inform not only our production decision changes, but how do we select the right genetics that not only achieves the reproduction efficiency that we heard the panel talking about and the productivity efficiency, but thinking about those carcass traits and the hard-to-measure traits beyond the farm gate, linking that whole supply chain, getting the feedback from our customers and ultimately the consumer flowing back to informing our genetic selection decisions. Now that's not a small task, but we have some of the leading experts in this field. We're very lucky to have the Program Manager for Genetics in Hamish Chandler and the Program Manager for MSA, who are going to take us through this part of the session. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Hamish Chandler to give us an introduction about the genetics component and linking genetics to profitability. Thanks, Hamish. Please join me in welcoming Hamish. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Mick. Good morning, everyone. So as Mick has already said, I'm MLA's Livestock Genetics Program Manager. So I thought I would very simply start with what the goal for the Livestock Genetics Program of work is. And it's simply creating another 400 million of industry benefit, of improvements for the industry by doubling the rate of genetic progress in the commercial livestock sector. So I'm not sure what keeps you guys awake at night, but a target like that's pretty much what keeps me awake at night. So how do we go about achieving that goal? How do we double the rate of genetic progress? So if you're a genetics nerd, that equation tells you how to go about doing something like that, and I know that there's a few faces in the audience that will really resonate with. For the rest of you, it's okay. I know what you're really thinking. What you're thinking actually was censored. I wasn't allowed to put it on a slide. So if we think about that in actual human terms, what controls the rate of genetic progress is selection intensity. So are we selecting just the best proportion of animals to breed from? Selection accuracy, so how good a job are we doing of choosing which are the best animals to actually breed from? And generation interval, how quickly are we getting new genes into our business to drive progress? Other than that, there's got to be genetic variation, otherwise we're wasting our time. So ultimately, that is what drives our rate of progress. And I guess if we stop and think about which bits of that can we really influence through our research and development programs, I guess at the moment most of the focus, not all, but most of the focus is really around how do we improve our selection accuracy. So how are we making sure that we are actually selecting the right animals more frequently? So we all know that performance is a combination of the genes that an animal is carrying and the environment we're running it in. I'm not telling you anything you don't know there. And we all know that the feed that the animal has had access to, its age of its mother even, disease and parasite burden, all of those things have got an impact on how big and fat and shiny a bull is on sale day or a ram is on sale day. We're not really interested in all of that stuff. What we're interested in is the genes that animal is carrying, because that's the bit that's passed on to the next generation. So all of these other non-genetic or environmental factors are the bits that mean that our accuracy of selection isn't as good as we might like. So with our research programs, how do we go about improving our understanding of what genes an animal is carrying and improving our accuracy so that we pick the right animals more frequently. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of different things that you guys might be wanting to select for. There's a whole range of things that people think about in their breeding programs. It's not my job to come around and tell you what you should be breeding for, but I think it's critically important that you stop and think, what is it that drives profitability in your business? What are the key drivers of profit? And then when we go to select a ram or a bull, how do we make sure we're aligning what we're looking for with what's actually driving profitability in our businesses? And I think we actually fail to draw the link between those two things fairly frequently. So that's something I would really very strongly encourage people to look at. Where are we actually investing money in the genetics program at the moment? So I guess at the moment, the major part of our investment is in reference populations, or herds, flocks of animals that we've set up to make sure that we are capturing all of the important information, all of those traits that we think have an impact on people's profitability, so we can improve accuracy of selection for those traits. After that, the next biggest one really is in the adoption space. And I think after what you've just been hearing this morning, I think that's critical. It's important to say that breeding values aren't magic. They're not going to do a thing to improve your livestock operation unless you're actually using that information to choose better animals. Over and above that, the next biggest investment is really in the genetic evaluations, in the analytical software. So in breed plan and sheep genetics analytical software. So over recent years, we've already introduced single-step genetic evaluation. So we're using DNA information simultaneously alongside our phenotypes and our pedigree data. We already have got software that's capable of multi-breed genetic evaluations for both beef and sheep. How do we keep developing that software to keep Australian genetic evaluations at the leading end of what's being done around the world? Genomics, other work going on in genomics other than the reference population to look at, are there other locations on the DNA that we should be looking at that are more informative for important traits to our breeding objective, so we can more accurately select for those traits. And then things like data platforms, so we can share information as an industry more effectively, and enablers, tools so that people understand how to use breeding values more efficiently. So if we just stop for a minute and think about what sort of progress are we already making. So for this, all we've done is aggregate across the temperate breeds of cattle, the rate of change for indexes, and over the last 10 years, we've been averaging somewhere around about $3 per cow per year. Over the last 5 years, that's improved a little bit. We're currently sitting on about $3.50 per cow joined per year. But it's important to think for a minute that genetic improvement is cumulative. So if you have been just buying breed average bulls using breed plan information over the last 10 years, when we've been averaging that $3 per cow joined per year, the cows you're joining this year are $30 more profitable than the cows we would have been using 10 years ago. So that cumulative benefit is really quite important. On the genomics front, I guess the basic principle of how genomics works is that we need a reference population. So this is where a large proportion of our funding is currently going. Somewhere for us to measure the traits of interest and measure genotypes on those animals, and essentially look at the relationship between the patterns you see on that DNA and the performance we're measuring. Particularly useful for hard to measure traits, traits that you can't measure until later on in life. Then when it comes to wanting to select young bulls or young rams out in industry, we're able to take a DNA test on them and say, we've seen these patterns on DNA somewhere before in this reference population. This is the sort of performance that it's related to. So what's that giving rise to? A couple of weeks ago up in Rockhampton, at the Brahman Week sales, you started seeing bulls like this advertised in the sale catalogue with a full set of breeding values. Not too much out of the ordinary about that, I guess, except once you start looking at what traits had that animal been measured for. So no 200, no 400, no 600 day weight or ultrasound scans. That animal has got that set of breeding values from a DNA test only. So it's now a reality that that animal can just have a DNA test and get a full set of breeding values with accuracies on those breeding values very similar to what we would have had if he had been measured himself for that trait. So obviously now working on higher accuracies for those traits and information for additional traits. Genetics campaign, we've already had people discussing adoption a little bit, but importantly the genetics campaign was rolled out back in June, looking at both print media and digital media, looking at case studies across a number of different businesses, what impact genetics information has had in those businesses. So if you haven't already had a look at genetics.mla.com.au, or have a look there, or come down and see the people down in the back corner at the stand. So before I hand over to Sarah, just in summary, I don't actually expect you all to understand and remember the breeder's equation, but I want you to just understand we're talking about how do we improve our accuracy of selection, so we're picking the better animals more frequently. How do we explain more of the variation that's out there in the population? So that's where the bulk of our work is sitting. Currently, we are making good genetic progress across a range of different sectors of the industry. In the temperate breeds, it's around about that $3.50 per cow join per year. How do we keep improving that? So at the moment, we're really looking at further R&D to improve on our selection accuracy further, and getting people to adopt the technology. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Sarah for an overview of the MSA program. Thank you.